Hey Podcast Babe, welcome to season 9 of the Podcast Babes podcast. My name is Anna Klasse, host of this pod and founder of the Podcast Babes. Every week, I interview and inspire a female podcaster here who has made her podcast work for her and her business. So tune in to learn from her mistakes, create your own profitable podcast. Here's today's episode. Hey Podcast Babes, welcome to a new episode. Today I'm here with Deb Krier. She's a seasoned entrepreneur, a cancer advocate, and host of the Business Power Hour podcast. I'm really excited to have her on the show today. Deb, welcome.
Hello. I am so delighted to be here and so honored to be on your program.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm so excited to learn a little bit more about your podcast because the Business Power Hour podcast has over 900 episodes. I think it's even almost 1,000. It's insane.
We'll hit 1,000 later this year.
Amazing. So I think we can learn a lot from you, Deb. To kick us off, can you tell us a little bit more about the podcast, what it's about, what you do on a podcast, and what it looks like?
Cool. It's the Business Power Hour. And I always have to say the because I'm here in the United States and I have trademarked the Business Power Hour, which is a tip that I always give to people. If you think somebody might steal your name, trademark it in the US. And I don't know if other countries have something similar, but yeah, so it is the Business Power Hour. I had to look it up. I started, the first one was September 12th of 2011. And
Wow.
earlier today, I recorded episode 976. So we will hit the 1,000 mark in September. I started by going into a radio station in Denver live. My guests would come in. And at that point, it was called The Socialite. And it was all about social media and how, because, this was long enough ago. That was when social media was really starting and businesses were saying, we don't know what we should do. What is this thing? Should we even be caring about it? And so we did that. And then I moved from Denver to Atlanta. The station wanted to keep me on. And so we started doing remote broadcasts. Initially, we did them live, which was great fun until they wouldn't work, right? And then I would get things like text messages, dead air. Oh, that's always fun. So then we went, oh my gosh, let's pre-record. Best thing that ever happened to podcasting is to be able to pre-record your podcast. I transitioned to being part of C-Suite Network, one of their podcasters. And about that point, we changed it to the Business Power Hour and, have just continued merrily along since then. We talk, obviously, business topics, but it's my podcast. I can do what I want with it. So we've also talked mental health. We've talked nutrition, did a lot of that during COVID, right? But yeah, it's great fun and I love doing it.
What I think is really interesting of what you just shared is that you started quite niche, right? It was for business owners about social media, so quite niche. And then you broadened the scope from there because you wanted to talk about different things, and that's also interesting for the same audience. So then you just add topics later, and that's something that I definitely recommend when especially business owners start a podcast. Start really narrow with one niche for one audience, and you can always go broader later, but it's better to start as a big fish in a small pond instead of talking about everything and then people don't know why they should tune into your podcast specifically. And sounds like that's what you did, right?
Right. And it makes it so much easier to figure out what you're going to be talking about. Because then okay, I'm talking about this, so I need this type of guest. And if you're trying to be everything to everyone, you're just going to be lost. And so, I know some podcasters who are very, very niche and have been that way for hundreds of episodes because they have enough content to be able to do that. So yeah, it's whatever works for you.
Yeah, exactly. So at the start in 2011, was it difficult to find guests for the podcast?
It was, especially because they were coming into the studio. And so that was kind of interesting. But like I said, it was about social media and everybody wanted to talk about it. So I could go to pretty much any PR or marketing firm and say, hey, you want to come talk about social media?
Yeah.
And they would come in and do that. I was able to get quite a few authors because again, that was, it was the flavor of the month. And so many people were writing books about it. But, there were times where it was a struggle. It was like, "Ugh, I don't want to have dead air. What are we going to talk about?"
Yeah, exactly. And how did you solve that challenge? Because I think for many podcasters, especially podcasters starting out, I think after a
Hmm.
while, when you have a very established podcast, you often
Hmm.
get pitched so often,
Hmm.
right? Like
Oh, yeah.
now for
Hmm.
my podcast, I open my inbox. I'm like, okay, well, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no,
Hmm. Hmm.
and we have our schedule for
Hmm.
guests.
Right.
But especially as
Hmm.
when you're starting out, that's just not the
Hmm.
reality often. So
Hmm.
how did you overcome that challenge?
Friends. you
Mm.
know, what I did was I went through my Facebook friends and through my LinkedIn connections. And, and now granted, we were talking about social media, so it kind of dovetailed, but so many times you have connections who are really great people that you can have on your podcast. And you just need to ask them, and I've had people who they've never done a podcast. So I try and, be really friendly with, and we're talking business, right? It's not like I'm going to do some big expose on them, but it's something to me, it's a marketing tool. And I know you talk about this, and I was looking on your website, you've got such great information there. It's a marketing tool. How do we get our message out there? And on the same thing, the guests want to use your podcast to get their message out there. So it was kind of one of those that really started spreading word of mouth. And I went after people who I figured they would tell me no. All of this time, I've had 2 flat out no's. Some have been, like one said, "Hey, I don't think I could talk for an hour," and because it's the business power hour. And I said, "Well, I just saw you give a 45-minute presentation, and it's my job as the host to have the content to be able to do that full thing." But yeah, people who I thought would tell me no came back immediately and said, "We would be delighted." And I was honest. I would say, "Hey, just starting out, would love to have you on." So that way they weren't expecting, lots of glitz and glamour. But yeah, everybody, we all like to be asked, right?
Yeah, true. Absolutely. And everyone likes to talk about
Mhm.
themselves and about their business,
Right. Mhm.
especially. And it is a
Mhm.
marketing
Mhm.
tool.
Mhm.
It can be a win-win for you as a
Mhm.
podcast host and for your
Right.
guest. And yeah, I think framing that well. I would also like to
Mhm.
add what I did when I started out with not this podcast, but my other podcast.
Mhm.
I asked people I knew, and then at the end of the interview, I would ask them, okay, so do you know anyone who would be a good fit for my
Right. Mhm.
podcast?
Mhm.
And some
Perfect.
people were like, maybe let me think about it. And
Mhm.
others, they just sent five, like introduced me to five
Right.
different people who then
Mhm.
all came on my
Mhm.
podcast. And then I asked them again, like, hey, great interview.
Mhm.
Thank you so much. Do you
I
know
love
anyone
it.
else who's
Mhm.
interested?
Right.
And that
Right.
worked so well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, big tip.
Yeah. If you've got a niche podcast that might not work because you might be asking them essentially to give their competitors.
Mhm.
But yeah, when you've got a broader audience, that's a perfect way to do it because then the person that referred them, they're saying, "Hey, I did this great thing for you."
Mhm.
And so it's definitely a win-win situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So you already shared a big change that you made from when you started a podcast, when you recorded everything live on the
Mhm.
radio, to then
Mhm.
shifting to pre-recording
Mhm.
so that
Mhm.
everything can be edited. And I mean, there is a lot less pressure, I think, when it's
Right.
not
Mhm.
live because you can mess up, start your sentence again, or
Right. Mhm.
I always tell guests, especially guests who are not as that experienced in podcasting, if I ask a question and you don't know the answer, don't worry, we'll just cut out the entire
Mhm.
question and no
Right.
one will know.
Mhm. Mhm. Every once in a while, I get a deer in headlights. They're like,
Yeah.
"Oh," but I try to not do that.
Exactly, exactly. But just, knowing that that is a possibility and that we can actually just cut out some like minutes of the conversation if we want to, I feel like really puts people at ease and just make them more comfortable. So that's a huge change. What other changes have you made in the past years of podcasting, or like any big changes that you can share with us?
Well, originally we were on Skype.
Mhm.
And then Zoom came about, and I love Zoom. And it's funny because Skype, and considering Skype is part of Microsoft, Zoom took over, right? And but about the point where we started really using Zoom a lot, we did start with a YouTube channel. I love being able to see my guests because it's almost like we're in the same room, right? But, I also don't have any illusions about our channel on YouTube. We are, it's a business podcast. It's these two talking heads for an hour. Not a lot of people are going to go to YouTube. People go to iTunes, they go to Spotify, they go to all of those things and they listen, but we have the YouTube channel because Google owns YouTube, right? So we have it for the SEO. But yeah, I love, love, love being able to see my guests. And every once in a while, I'll have one that will say, I would prefer for it not to go on to video. And that's fine. I don't, I'm not going to post it if they, like I had somebody the other day that he said, I don't think I'm dressed for this. And I did have a guest one time who didn't want it for audio. I said, um, you don't you understand the concept here, right? But yeah, I love being able to see my guests, and that I think has been one of the best things that have come about. And the really nice thing is you can do a podcast without spending a boatload of money. I think that's been the other thing that has really been nice through the years. Your mic is $100. Your hosting in many cases ends up being the most expensive thing that you're doing. And so yeah, it's great to be able to do that. I know a lot of people who do their podcasts simply using their smartphone. And that works just fine.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is very accessible, I think.
Mhm,
And if you don't want to do video, then you don't have to do
mhm,
video. But yeah,
right.
putting it on
Mhm.
YouTube is that you get that SEO benefit for sure. Have you ever tried anything or tried to make a change and then it didn't work out?
Well, just getting used to the technology has always been kind of one of the challenges. And I look at new platforms. I know that you're doing this on Squadcast. There's several other types of things. I've just kind of stuck with Zoom because I like it. But that's kind of one of those things. Is you have to test, right? Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
Mhm.
I think, of course, the trickiest thing is when technology fails,
Yeah.
and your internet goes out, or all sorts of things. But it was a challenge when we had COVID and everybody all of a sudden, were in home offices that might have been their kitchen table and all sorts of
Yep.
things like that. But it's one of those where I try it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But once I find something, I try and stick with it. I'm looking forward to trying some of the new AI things and
Mm.
dabbling my toes in, how can some of those make this a little bit easier for me?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's actually a really good tip as well because there are so many new softwares, and I think not getting that shiny object syndrome and just keep looking
Right.
for the
See, and
next
that
thing
is
and the
me,
next thing.
squirrel. You know?
I feel like that's really really normal, really natural for especially entrepreneurs, right? We see opportunities, which is great, but that can also mean that it can distract from what's working. And for you, that might be Zoom until there is another software that's just so much better that it makes a lot of sense to switch. Yeah, we use Squadcast mainly because the video quality is slightly better in my experience, especially when people's internet connection is not 100% ideal. Um, so it records locally on our both of our computers, and then at the end it uploads to the cloud. And in Zoom, it kind of records in the middle, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I record on Zoom to my computer because I
Mhm,
don't always trust that it's going to work to go to the cloud.
mhm, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so for that means that your guest's video could be, I don't know, slightly lower quality,
Mhm,
but that's the biggest difference.
mhm,
And what I do really like about Squadcast is they have a backup. So I've
mhm,
had several times that something went wrong with
mhm.
the recording, and then we
Right.
used the backup recording. And then
Mhm,
sometimes there was no video, or then you only have one
mhm,
track for you and your guest. It's not
mhm.
100% ideal, of course,
Right.
but we didn't have to re-record,
Mhm,
so that was
mhm.
really really helpful.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So that's
And I think people aren't expecting Hollywood style productions, right? You've got a little background noise. You've got this that happens, that happens. There's somebody outside right now who is doing their lawn, and so we've got weird noises. The cat appears, the kid appears. Your technology glitches, all of those things. To me, that makes it more interesting because it shows that we're human beings.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree with you. And also the great thing about
Mhm,
pre-recording, if the doorbell rings and you have to get it,
mhm,
that's fine.
mhm.
We can actually do
Right.
that.
Yeah. I tell people now I do on my podcast, I do not heavy edit. I leave in the uhs, the ums, the you knows. Because to me, we're having a conversation and we pause and we say, and So I leave those in. And then if there's something big that happens, I may or I may not take it out. I was interviewing a young lady one time whose 3-year-old woke up and was not happy that dad was there. That child wanted mom, and bless that no, I mean, she's screaming. She's just screaming, and I said, "Okay, we're just gonna hit pause. You're gonna go do what you need to do. Don't worry however long that takes. This is fine. Family always comes first,
Mhm.
but, I've had cats. I've had Catzilla, that goes right up to the microphone or to the camera, right? I've had kids appear, all sorts of things, and so I leave those in, but I also, there are times where it's like, "Nah, that does need to be edited out."
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Okay, so Deb, after all these years of podcasting, after so many episodes, almost hitting 1,000, what have you experienced through the podcast? As in, like, what kind of results did you see in your business, or maybe not for your business, maybe just for you personally? Can you share a little bit more about that?
Well, my podcast is not monetized. And I know that, many people they do monetize, and there's a whole bunch of different ways to be able to do that. I'm just too lazy to do it. um, you know, um, but for me, it is a marketing tool. I am talking about what I do and things like that, but I also get to have conversations with absolutely wonderful people. And I always learn, no matter what I'm talking about or who I'm talking to, I always learn something. And to me, that's worth it. And then I'm hoping that my listeners are also learning. But I get to have these fantastic conversations several times a week with true leading people in their fields. And it's so much fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I love that you mentioned that because I think a lot of people focus in terms of results from podcasts on
Mhm.
either monetary results or
Mhm.
download
And I look
numbers.
at my numbers and go, "Hmm."
Of course, I think we all have that sometimes because
Mhm.
there's always
Right.
someone with more downloads,
Mhm.
always, right?
Right. Mhm.
Unless you're Joe
Mhm.
Rogan, and probably even then there's
Mhm.
someone with more
But he
downloads.
pays for that. I mean, there's a whole different
Yeah,
process that somebody like that goes through.
true. But I really love that you mentioned that the conversations that you're having, that it brings a lot for you, that you learn from it, that you expand your network probably through those conversations. You must know so many people by now after so many interviews, right?
Mhm.
So I think that's also a really good thing to keep in mind, that it's not
Mhm.
all about the numbers.
Mhm.
And then, yes, it can definitely be a marketing tool. And I would even
Mhm.
say that you have your podcast monetized because you use it to market your business. So
Right.
even though
Mhm.
it's not a
Mhm.
sponsorship,
Mhm. Mhm.
we actually do consider that a monetized
Yes.
podcast
Mhm.
because you
Mhm.
you have something to sell and you
Mhm.
can get clients that
Mhm.
way.
Right.
So that's
Right.
actually awesome. Amazing.
Mhm.
Do you have
Right.
any maybe final tip for other
Mhm.
podcasters from your experience?
Yeah. Yeah, don't be afraid to ask. Like I said, the least that can happen is they say no. The most is they say, "I would be delighted to." And then I made the decision, and it's been about 5 years ago or so, I hired a producer, right? So, I have my wonderful VA who does much of my podcast. She does all the scheduling, she does the social media posting, all of those things that I can do myself. I did for years, right? But it was not the best use of my time, and she's really, really good at it. And since she's a VA, I tell her this is how many hours per week I want you to do. So it is kind of one of those things that, if you're able to, you might think about outsourcing it. But my biggest tip is you got to have fun with it. If you are not enjoying the conversations that you are having with people, then you need to rethink it. To me, and maybe that's why I like Zoom. It's like, okay, I'm sitting here for 30 minutes talking with Ann over, I've got water, you've got water. Sometimes later in the day, we might have an adult beverage, right? Or a cup of coffee or something like that. And so to me, it's just this great conversation that I'm having with someone. And I think that's what we should always think about is, if we have 0 people who listen, we still should have these great conversations.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're so right. And that has actually been a very big shift, a mindset shift that I made a few years ago with my own podcast because I was so focused on numbers, on download numbers. And I was like, well, why am I doing this? No one's listening. And then I told myself, okay, let's do this for a year, focus on the conversations, and go for consistency, just enjoy the journey, and we'll see what happens. That's now 3 years ago, and we're still producing weekly content. I'm still having weekly conversations with people and interviews, and it's been so interesting how much more fun it has been since seeing it that way, but also how much the podcast has grown just from being consistent. And I think a big reason is because people can hear how passionate I am, and it's just you're building trust by being so consistent. So the audience knows, okay, there's an episode every week, or for you, it's multiple times a week. So I think that in itself is so valuable. And then you don't even have to do all the other things that you also could be doing, like video and social media. And of course, yes, would be good, but starting with that, having fun, being consistent, that's the way to start. I love that.
Definitely.
Great advice.
And for those who are thinking, oh my gosh, it does seem difficult, that's where it helps to work with someone like Anne, who, because I just started winging it, right? And, it's great to be able to have outside resources to help you through that process. Because yeah, you shouldn't get all caught up in, oh, I have to do this, I have to do this. You just want to have the conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. 100%. Absolutely true. Deb, thank you so much for sharing your podcasting wisdom with us today. Can you share where people can find you and where people can find your podcast?
Sure. Easy peasy. Thebusinesspowerhour.com. And so love for you to go in and listen to episodes there. You can also find me on all the social. There's not a lot of Deb Kriers, and so it's pretty easy to find the one with the bright red hair. So connect with me, LinkedIn, Facebook. I don't do too many of the other socials because I'm like squirrel. I'd never, if I was on TikTok, I'd never leave. But yeah, so Facebook and LinkedIn are the places to really find me.
Perfect. We'll make sure to add all the links to the show notes, so you can go to the
Thank
show
you.
notes, click all the links there, follow Deb, listen to the podcast for sure. I think it's a really great podcast. I've really enjoyed the episodes that I listened to so
Oh,
far, and I
thank
have a
you.
lot more to go, of course. So that's great. Lots of business advice.
970 something.
Exactly. So we have something to do for the next couple of years, probably, which is great. Deb, thank you so much for coming on the show today. This has been really great.
Thank you. And as I said, I'm very honored to have been your guest.
Thank you. All right, that's it for today's episode. Need some help to get your podcast off the ground? Not sure where to start and what to focus on? Go to thepodcastbabes.com to schedule a call and learn more about our podcast launch and production services. See you next week.